Hi, this is Nun from Sound Particles. It's a pleasure to be here on this series on how to program a synth. Today we're going to talk about LFOs. That is a very important component in any synth. So LFOs means low frequency oscillators. So it's an oscillator like the main oscillators, but it's a low frequency. And this means that low frequency, why? Because although the other oscillators, their goal, their function is to create audio, okay, LFOs, they are used not to create audio, but to actually control some parameters of the synthesizer. Because when you're creating audio, you need audio, it's between 20 to 20,000 hertz, which means that you have relatively high value in terms of oscillators, their frequencies, but LFOs usually go much slower. They have frequencies around 0.1 hertz, 1 hertz, 5 hertz. So it's a kind of frequency that if I would use this directly connected to a speaker, I would not be able to listen them because it's too low frequency for us to hear. But essentially what we want is to have an oscillator controlling something. For instance, imagine that I have an oscillator like this controlling gain, and you get the gain to go wow, 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 and you get the LFO controlling gain. Or imagine an LFO controlling pitch, and you want to get this kind of vibrato, and pretty much you have the oscillators controlling this, the pitch of the main oscillator. So LFOs, low frequency oscillators, are a special kind of oscillators. They are there not to create audio, but actually to create a signal that is used to control some parameters of the synthesizer. Of all the parameters used by LFOs, the most common one is controlling pitch to get a vibrato. So pretty much when you get a vibrato, what you do is you slightly change the pitch of the note, and for that we use an LFO. So let's dive in here to hear once again a small example. As usual, what I have here, it's a basic sine. Okay, it's a sine wave. Let's change this, for instance, for a square. So it's a traditional square. So what we're going to do now is we're going to the pitch tab, pretty much as SkyDust. This is where we have the pitch related things. And then let's use an LFO to control pitch. So in here I have this LFO, okay? So in this LFO you have multiple waveforms. So you can have square, triangle, all of those things. In this case, for a vibrato, most of the times we use the sine. That it's a much more interesting behavior for the vibrato. Okay, so what I have here, well, of course, if I do this, currently this is a high, crazy vibrato. No, it's not what we want. So let's dial down this to something more or less 20 cents or something like that. Okay, so now you can see that there's this slightly variation in terms of pitch. Let's increase the rate here. If I'm disable this is the regular with no LFO. With LFO now I have this. Okay, so what I have here, yes, we have the shape of the wave. Okay, in this case I'm using a sine. Okay, then what we do is, okay, let's have the rate. The rate controls what is the frequency of this oscillator. So as you can see, very low values, like once a second. Okay, or if you want even slower or faster. And then we have the depth, is how impactful you want this to be. In this case, since we are controlling the pitch, we have this in steps. Okay, so in this case, we only have a few cents. Okay, of course, you can go crazy and say, okay, most of the times we don't want that. We want only a small variation. Okay, so another thing that also it's important when you're talking about LFOs, is that usually you have this parameter called the delay. And the idea is instead, because imagine someone playing the violin. Usually what happens is you play a note and then you start adding a few vibrato later on. So you play first the note and then you start adding the vibrato. So which means that most of the times with the synth, sometimes you also want the same kind of behavior. So you want to play a note and not get instant vibrato when you play the note, but you want the vibrato to start appearing later on. So that's the goal of delay. As it is nowadays, I'm playing the note, as currently it is, I play the note and you get vibrato right from the start. Okay? If I want to add some delay and say, okay, I want to wait 1 second until I get to the full vibrato. So what we are doing here is, okay, I don't want vibrato right from the start. I want vibrato to go slowly and increase, and during, in this case, takes 1.2 seconds until it gets to its full speed. In some synthesizers, what they do, this controls the depth of the vibrato. In our synth, the SkyDust, we decide to also slightly change the rate to get a much more interesting result. So not only the depth, but also the rate until reaching the full rate of everything. So that's the LFO controlling vibrato versus. So the vibrato gives a little more personality. It could be interesting. And of course, you can always try different shapes. Okay. One other thing that usually we want to do when having a vibrato is that most of the times people like to use the modulation wheel to control the amount of vibrato that you want to add. And there are, depending on the synthesizer, some synthesizers by default the modulation wheel controls the vibrato, others they are not controlled by default. For instance, in SkyDust, if you want to use that, are press multiple situations. One of them is, of course, you can simply say MIDI, let me come here. Okay, in MIDI learn now, if I change the modulation wheel, it knows that now modulation wheel is controlling this. So, for instance, I could do something like this. Okay, once again, depending on how you want to control, if you want this to create crazy things. Okay, if you know that now I don't want this amount of things, then of course you can go here to the matrix and then slightly change how you control things over there. But for now, let's focus here on the LFO. We're going to talk about matrix later on this series. So play with LFO. Yes, LFOs can be used for multiple other things. You can use LFO to control the volume. You can use LFO to control a waveform modifier and change the timbre of things. You can use an LFO to control the filter. In case of SkyDust, you can control even the position in 3D space. So very important thing for you to know how to use, and I hope you like it. Next session, we're going to talk about sequencers and arpeggiators and creating arpeggios with the synthesizer. So stay tuned.